Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Americans and Canadians working together on migration in the Biden-Harris era. That era is going to be starting quite soon, as we all know. It's already started for many of us, and we here in Canada are very much looking forward to working together with our colleagues in the United States to address several key issues that are on the forefront of the agenda as regards migration. Migration, as we all are aware, is so fundamental to both of our countries and has played a substantial role in the evolution of Canada and the United States and will continue to do so going forward. This has been, of course, a very challenging year for all of us, both here in Canada and the United States and elsewhere in the world, with the impacts of COVID-19 on our populations and the disproportionate effect of COVID-19 on so many migrants in both of our countries and on various other communities. So there's a lot to discuss, and we're very fortunate to have a real stellar group of speakers today that will discuss some of the issues and suggest ways forward for better cooperation between our two countries. I want to thank my team at the Association for Canadian Studies in Metropolis, North America, for putting this together, and a very special thanks to my colleague, Adam Hunter, who's the Executive Director of Refugee Council USA, for agreeing to co-sponsor this webinar with us. Adam and I and Agustin Escobar from Mexico have been working together for a few years to build Metropolis North America, and we've been fortunate over the past few months to have succeeded in securing a Canadian Institute for Health Research grant. And with that, we'll be able to generate over the course of 2021 substantial data on the impacts on newcomers and racialized communities and Indigenous peoples of COVID-19, and look forward to holding several events under the Metropolis North America brand to help us gain insights into some of the key issues to support the binational conversation around migration in our two countries. On that note, I suppose I will come back at the end of the day to talk about our desire to create a Metropolis North America presence in the US and talk about a job ad that we're going to be posting, in fact, to identify someone who can carry Metropolis North America forward. So, with all that said, avec tout ceci dit, je vais passer la parole à Adam Hunter. Encore merci à tous les participants au Canada, aux États-Unis. On a un excellent programme qui va être présenté d'ici jusqu'à 2h30 à 14h30. Et nous espérons qu'on va identifier des pistes de solutions afin de travailler étroitement avec l'administration Biden-Harris dans les années à venir. So, with that said, I pass the speaking role to my good friend and colleague, Adam Hunter.
Thanks, Jack, and merci à Montréal. Nice to be joining you all today. I'm Adam Hunter, based in Washington, D.C. I'm Executive Director of Refugee Council USA, which is a 29-member coalition advocating for the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and other humanitarian protection populations, and working to bulwark our protection programs here in the United States and around the world. As Jack mentioned, I've been his personal partner in the Metropolis North America effort since we founded that initiative in 2017, and I'm grateful to carry this partnership forward into this new role. Just a couple of stage setting remarks. We are looking ahead to a lot of change in the migration, border, refugee, asylum realm under the Biden-Harris administration. We've been very fortunate in our meetings with the incoming transition teams to have an understanding of high-level policy issues that they will be promoting and to be approaching these issues with a different degree of partnership. It's pretty clear to observe under the 4 years of the Trump administration that the executive can pretty unilaterally and pretty quickly create a lot of harm and create chaos. But in order to build the changes that we seek, the fixes that are important, The incoming team, I think, well recognizes that it is not just up to the government alone, but is up to the NGO partners, to the wider community, and to our international counterparts in Canada and other places to work in partnership to get these programs right, to get these strategies right, and to have more effective outcomes for all of our citizens. So with that spirit, I'm really pleased for the partnership and for the discussions we'll be having today and the many friends and colleagues who are on panels and joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce our chair of the first panel, a friend and colleague from the great state of Michigan, Fayrouz Saad, who is Executive Director of the Office of Global Michigan in the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. She was also formerly the Detroit Mayor's Office Immigrant Affairs Director under Mayor Mike Duggan, and had been an appointee in the Obama administration's Department of Homeland Security. Fayrouz, I'd like to welcome you to join and lead us through your panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. I was just waiting to be unmuted and allowed to come on video. So good afternoon, everyone. My French is very rusty, but bonjour et merci pour l'invitation. I'm happy to be here with you all, and I'm grateful for the invitation. Again, my name is Fayrouz Saad, and as an American, but particularly a Michigander, this conversation is really interesting and fascinating to me. As many of you hopefully know, here in Michigan, we border Canada. When I was in Detroit, I like to remind everyone that we were actually north of Canada in Detroit and many places across Michigan. And as the Director of Immigrant Affairs, a lot of our immigrants were Canadians. And so it is a particularly interesting discussion given where I am physically, but also, as Adam alluded to, given the environment that we are now in here in the United States. As many of you know, it has certainly been an interesting 4 years within the topic of immigration and migration within the United States, and particularly having seen how that has been playing out between our two countries under the Trump administration, and now more recently, of course, in a post and I guess during COVID environment. And so yesterday, we officially elected a new president of the United States. And that will be Biden, and of course, his vice president, Kamala Harris. And so we're about to head into, I think, another new era of what immigration means here within the United States, what it means in terms of our partnership with Canada, how our two countries are allied in this conversation, and potentially where are some of the distinctions and differences that we will start to surface as many of the dynamics at play start to play out in terms of the effect that COVID has had on our economy, on the immigration system, how the Trump administration's impact on the refugee resettlement program has impacted us here as well, and how that will play out as we start to work towards increasing those numbers. So I am particularly pleased to be part of this discussion. And with that, I would like to introduce you all to our two panelists who will be able to offer some further insights into the roles that both the US and Canada plays within immigration. So first is Ms. Doris Meisner. She's a senior fellow and director of US Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute, or MPI as we call them. Doris Meisner is a senior fellow at MPI, where she directs the Institute's US immigration policy work. She's the former Executive Associate Commission of the US Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is now known as USCIS. And her work and expertise focus on immigration and politics, immigration enforcement, border control, cooperation with other countries, and immigration and national security. Our panelist who will speak after Doris is Mr. David Hertel, who is the Government Relations Counsel at Baskin, former Quebec Minister of Immigration, Diversity, and Inclusiveness. And Mr. Hertel is he also serves as an adjunct professor at Concordia University and political analyst. He served in several positions in Quebec, provincial cabinet, including as Minister of Immigration, Diversity, and Inclusiveness from 2017 to 2018. And before our panelists begin the discussion, I would just like to remind everyone that while we encourage a lively chat within the chat box, please reserve all your questions for the Q&A box, because that's what we will be moderating to help facilitate the Q&A discussion. So with that, Doris, I hand it over to you.
All right, now am I on? All right,
Yes.
You can see me, you can hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Hello, Adam, my friend from many years back, and new friends in this forum. I'm pleased to be with you. And what am I supposed to do here? Oh, so I just start your video.
No, you look good.
Okay, all right. Do we have it now?
Beautiful.
All right, excuse me. So, okay, I'm going to talk about the incoming Biden administration and what we can expect. But of course, we have to do that based on the 4 years of the current administration, which, as you all know, is probably been the most, immigration has been an absolute centerpiece of the Trump governing, and it's resulted in more than 400 specific actions, which we have reported on over these years. So there's a tremendous amount on the table, substantively, that has happened in 4 years. But it's also the case that the incoming Biden administration has made a lot of promises where immigration is concerned, and they deal both with undoing things that happened during the Trump years, as well as doing many other things differently from the way we've seen them in the last 4 years. Because the Trump legacy was brought about almost entirely through executive action, that of course can switch to the other side, and that means that a Biden administration has a good deal of leeway also using executive action to move forward its agenda. The result, of course, is going to be a continuation of what we've seen in the United States over quite a few years now, and that is truly wild swings from one administration to another in the way that we deal with immigration. But be that as it may, you know, the ride has begun. So I'm going to talk first about the first 100 days, because the first 100 days are packed with commitments that the incoming administration has made. And then we'll go on and talk about the harder issues that have to do with the southwest border, and then finally other aspects of the Trump record that remain on the table. So where the first 100 days are concerned, of course, the incoming administration has identified a series of actions, many of which can be taken quite quickly and are doable and will make a real statement about a shift. So in no particular order, let me go through some of the top line ones. They will probably begin with rescinding the travel bans that are in place. And the rescinding of those travel bans is very easy to do because those are executive actions. They simply need to be reversed. They will also reinstate the DACA program. And the DACA program, where that's concerned, they've been assisted particularly by a judge's ruling just a week or two ago that puts the DACA program as it was originally established in the Obama years in 2012 back into place. But there is a lurking difficulty there with a lawsuit that is pending in Texas that questions entirely the legal authority for the president to create the DACA program. And if there is a judgment on that, and even trying to work around a possible judgment on that, which could hold the action illegally, it's possible that we'll see an entirely new DACA executive order that would be more carefully inoculated from litigation. But DACA is definitely very much at the top of the list. Thirdly, the incoming administration has promised a 100-day moratorium on deportations. And that 100-day moratorium on deportations would obviously begin on January 20th, but it really allows and buys them time to put a number of other things into place, including things that have to do with interior enforcement, especially guidelines, prosecutorial discretion guidelines, which would get rid of the Trump administration's initiatives that everybody in the country illegally is subject to deportation at any point. So restoring prosecutorial discretion guidelines would look a lot more like the interior enforcement policies of the Obama administration, but they will be slightly different. We do believe that they will tweak those guidelines to some extent, but that 100 days will give them time to do that, as well as to end these 287G programs. These are the programs that cooperate with local law enforcement around the country on immigration enforcement, and probably also begin to do some things differently that have to do with detention. But I'm going to get to that separately. Then there will also be an immediate action, I believe, to restore refugee admissions ceilings at the level of 125,000. As you know, we're now this year at 15,000, at the lowest level ever since the 1980 Refugee Act was enacted. So reinstituting refugee admissions at a much higher level will send a very important signal, but it will also take some time. And I'm sure the next panel will talk about this, because the refugee resettlement infrastructure has been so hollowed out over these last 4 years. But the signal on being open again to refugees and being a country that wants to be a global leader where humanitarian issues is concerned, that will come very early. There's also the commitment to reunite the 600 plus children with families in Central America who were separated during the separation of families policies. There is a commitment to sending a bill to Congress that would legalize, would be a request to legalize as many as the possible of the 11 million people in our population who don't have a legal status. That bill, of course, might be simply a legalization bill. It might be a bill that includes other aspects of immigration reform. We don't know yet. And then finally, I would say on this first 100-day list is the commitment to end long-term detention. This would be a good time to do it because right now, based on the pandemic, there are less than 20,000 people in detention. That's down from about 50,000 when it's been at its highest. So to further reduce that population would be able to be done starting from a much lower level. So all of those things are ready, are an ambitious agenda, but they are quite doable, and they are quite doable largely in a relatively brief period of time. We then, however, get to what I believe are the far more complex issues, and those are the issues that have to do with the Southwest border. On the Southwest border, we can begin with the easiest one. The easiest one is the wall. We know, of course, that the wall has been the signature, a signature issue, but certainly was the signature campaign issue for Trump's being elected in 2016. And that has resulted in, at last count of maybe about a week ago, 423 miles of new wall having been built. That was on top of close to probably about 700 that had already been in place. So that does bring the proportion of wall to over 1,000, to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,100 miles. And it's a 2,000-mile border with Mexico. So there has been substantial progress there. But that can be ended almost immediately as well, even mid-contract, with contractors who are there building. And Biden has said that there will not be one additional mile of wall built under his administration. We'll see if that happens, because with that amount of wall that I just described, it's very expensive to maintain, and there does need to be substantial maintenance done. Every administration since the first Bush administration has done not only maintenance, but some building of wall. But the degree to which it happens, I believe, will be back in the hands of the Border Patrol as an operational matter and a budget matter rather than a presidential priority. So where the wall is concerned and where border enforcement is concerned, I think you'll see a shift, obviously, away from barriers, but toward much more technology, more investment at ports of entry, more virtual wall and virtual enforcement kinds of investments. But then we get to the difficult part, which has to do with the other aspect of what the Trump administration has so focused on, and that has been the asylum system and the shutdown, the virtual shutdown of any meaningful access to asylum at the southwest border. That is, of course, a function of executive authority, but it is going to be difficult to reinstate more humane policies in the way that the incoming administration has promised, because of the inherent tension that exists between relaxing policies in any way, even though they would adhere once again to US law and to international law and commitments, because of the signal that it can send to people in the region that want to come to the United States. We're seeing already that message carrying forward. And so that tension is going to really be a difficult problem for an incoming administration to manage. I think that we will see right off an ending of the MPP program, these migration protection protocols called, we think of as Remain in Mexico, because that's been a particularly harsh feature of the Trump policies. And there are about 25,000 of those cases pending. I think we will see the government taking over the ability of those people to come into the United States in an orderly fashion through this metering system that is in place, but that I think the government will now run. But they will, I believe, try to bring people gradually in through ports of entry and allow them to pursue their asylum claims while they're in the United States. But allowing them to pursue their asylum claims in the United States will be fairly meaningless until the guidance is changed under which asylum is currently being adjudicated, because the Trump administration has left almost no room for any kinds of claims that are at all similar to the circumstances that people, particularly from Central America, are fleeing. And that guidance and overriding and reworking that guidance depends on new decisions by an incoming attorney general that have to do with precedents that the Board of Immigration Appeals and immigration judges need to follow, as well as rewriting the guidance for them and for asylum officers. So that will take some time to put into place. The other factor here that will be very important and interesting to watch is the public health order, the CDC order that is in place at the southwest border. It's very much still under discussion from everything we know, whether the incoming administration will leave that order in place. And they may very well leave it in place because we will continue to have a public health emergency. And it is it is one way that you can, and it has, of course, proven to be a way that the pressure on the border has been reduced somewhat. So I would not be surprised if that order remains in place for a while. I don't think permanently, and certainly we know now with the vaccine that there is some light at the end of this pandemic tunnel, but that is going to be a mitigating factor at the southwest border. Beyond that, the new administration, of course, wants to introduce some new policies. It doesn't want to just undo things. And it has talked about surging asylum officers to the southwest border so that cases can be more readily heard, particularly at the credible fear level. But it's also talked about changing the regulations in ways that would allow asylum officers to fully adjudicate on the merits asylum claims at the southwest border so that those decisions can be made in a more timely fashion. And to do that requires a regulation which does take considerably more time. And finally, of course, the administration is talking about doubling the numbers of immigration judges. That requires budgets, hiring, training, etc. So there's a much longer tail here or trail here of actions that need to be put into place in order to meaningfully restore a fair and timely asylum system at the southwest border without at the same time igniting a migration emergency, humanitarian emergency of flows. Part of what we will see also, though, in a new administration doing that is much more of a focus on the region and much more of a focus on working with partner countries, which includes Canada, Mexico, and the Central American countries themselves. I think we will see in this administration more of a focus on North America, Central America as a region, and steps that can be taken over the longer term, of course, but that you need to start somewhere to really deal with the region and the causes of these flows. In that regard, I think that the increase in refugee numbers might prove to be an important tool, not only as a signal, but as a real change if we see that more numbers out of that 125,000 level are allocated to the Western Hemisphere, which would be a real change from the way in which the refugee resettlement program has traditionally taken place in the United States. Those actions would then involve bringing UNHCR and IOM into a regional role that would try to create safety opportunities closer to home. And so the refugee program here may serve as an early tool to send not only a signal to the world that the US is back in the business where humanitarian values and programs are concerned, but will be applying them closer to home than has perhaps been the case historically. So finally, let me quickly wrap up by saying that there are a whole series of other things that are on the table that the Biden administration has committed to do, but that are also longer term or more discrete. Certainly, there are a range of regulations that the administration has talked about undoing. Probably the most prominent one is what's known as the public charge regulation, which has really chilled the legal immigration flows to the United States, if nothing else out of fear, but that has really created very much more narrow restrictions on vetting legal immigration applicants. There's a lot of policy guidance that goes everywhere from the H-1B program to narrowing the independence of immigration judges and how it is that they run their courtrooms. We can expect those things to be undone. There's a lot of pending litigation. Litigants will have a good deal of leverage over the administration in trying to settle some of these lawsuits. Those are longer term discussions that will be in place. Of course, Congress.
Doris, I hate to interrupt. Sorry, I just want to make sure we have time for other panelists in a Q&A. And I think we can get into some of this with the Q&A, but please go ahead and you want to wrap up the thought and
I will. I will. There is so much to do. So all we can say is that Congress has been missing in action, and I think we'll continue to see Congress miss in action. So thank you very much, and please hand over.
Great, thank you. David, if you want to jump in here, the floor is yours.
I thank you, Farouz, and I was so into what Doris Meisner was saying, and the list is very long, and it was very interesting. What I can bring in terms of a Canadian perspective, and as Doris Meisner was talking, she started with contextualizing with the current administration. I think I can do the same here and talk from an asylum seeker's perspective of some of the impacts of the current administration and soon to be former administration. Back in early 2017, the Trump administration announced its intention to rescind special status that had been given under the Obama administration to certain refugee claimants. One of those groups was the substantial amount of men and women and children from Haiti who came to the US following the devastating 2010 earthquake. And other refugee claimants from Central American countries, for example, were given similar status under the Obama administration. And in 2017, early 2017, the Trump administration announced its intention to rescind that status. The consequence was that over the following months, starting in the summer of 2017, on into the winter, Canada, and mainly through the province of Quebec, received close to 20,000 asylum seekers, where before, in the 5 years previous to 2017, Canada would receive between an average of 2,000 to 5,000 asylum seekers. And so this was a tremendous increase, putting significant pressure both on the federal government, and over 90%, close to 95% of all these asylum seekers were coming through the province of Quebec. And so this put enormous pressure not only on the federal government, but also on the province of Quebec, mainly the city of Montreal, community groups that deal with asylum seekers. Montreal has a very important Haitian community, for example. And so this was a direct consequence of that announcement. And so for several weeks and months, certain political parties were even talking about, well, should we close the border? There was a big debate on the status of the Canada-US safe third country agreement, and should that agreement be renegotiated or reopened. So there was a lot of discussion and a lot of pressure put on both the federal, provincial, municipal, and other members of civil society in Canada to deal with that onslaught. I was even called at the time a crisis. And so one of the consequences of that, moving on to 2018, was that there was another wave of asylum seekers, and again, close to 20,000 asylum seekers, again coming through Quebec, but this time not people who were in the US for several years and fearing that their special status was going to be rescinded. These people came from elsewhere around the world, flying into the United States and going up again through Quebec, just like many members of the US Haitian community had done in 2017, going through again Quebec and again replicating the same sort of situation that was going on, and putting again intense pressure on a system. And I'll remind people watching today that already the asylum seeker system in Canada was already overloaded. Even at 2,000 to 5,000 cases per year, you had a system that could not handle the caseload to get a hearing for an asylum seeker in Canada prior to the crises of 2017 and 2018. It could take up to 24 months to even get your first hearing on your asylum seeker case, and in some cases could drag on for 3, 4, even 5 years. And during that time, you had a situation where asylum seekers, where their status was still pending, had successfully integrated into Canadian society, had jobs, families, and were fully integrated, but yet lived under the uncertainty of not knowing if their asylum seeker status would be granted by the federal government. And so this put an additional very major pressure on a system that was already overwhelmed, and put a lot of financial pressure both at the federal, provincial, and local level. And so the idea is that now what we saw also during the Trump administration is that even though there were attempts by the federal government and pressure from the provinces to see if there could be a way of dealing with this with the US, you had a lot of political maneuvering and very delicate negotiations at the same time on what became the US MCA agreement, the new free trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico. So it was very difficult to even try to have a conversation on the Safe Third Country Agreement, or have established some sort of framework or collaboration framework on, for example, asylum seekers coming from outside the United States and automatically trying to come to Canada. And so this is something that hopefully can open a conversation with the incoming Biden administration on the necessity of a framework that I think needs to include not only obviously both federal governments, but also at the state and provincial level. We saw this during the pandemic as well. The fact is with the USMCA being in force now, but even previously with the previous free trade agreement, if you look specifically, for example, Canada and the US have a very integrated economic system. And during the pandemic, and we're seeing, especially the first few months of the pandemic, we saw significant issues being raised with the fact that a lot of different sectors have fully integrated supply chains and manufacturing chains. And so the closing of the border and the fact that there wasn't necessarily free movement between both borders showed how much both economies are completely integrated, and that raised significant issues about how to deal with the fact that certain provinces, from one perspective, you have the certain provinces and certain states declaring that certain sectors, economic sectors, were essential, and other provinces or other states wouldn't. So within the same economic sector, or within the same economic supply chain, you could have one province or one state saying that sector is not essential, so it must be locked down. But other provinces and other states would say, no, this sector can go on, and it is essential, and is not locked down. So the reason why I bring up this point is from an immigration standpoint. This raises very significant issues, because even before the pandemic, and this has been maintained and is still ongoing during the pandemic, from a Canadian perspective, we are living through a major labor shortage. And this labor shortage was evident before the pandemic, but has been sustained during the pandemic, especially in certain sectors, for example, healthcare. And at every level of the healthcare system. We also saw that in mass manufacturing, which is very interesting, because strategically speaking, every time we hear about economic recovery, we talk about bringing back to either Canada, we've heard this from the US as well, certain strategic sectors of manufacturing, bringing them back within our borders, because the pandemic has revealed that certain sectors are very strategic, and not to be dependent on other countries for certain strategic supplies, and not only in the healthcare system, but in other sectors. We need that mass manufacturing. And so this again raises the issue and the importance of relying on immigration. But not only in mass manufacturing, agriculture, which obviously is strategic in itself. We've seen that this sector is going through a very important labor shortage. We've seen stories throughout the summer and fall of different farmers across Canada having to literally destroy certain their production, because they couldn't get enough labor to get that to market, to get those productions to market. And so the overall perspective and the message I would like to put forward here is that immigration is also, and not only economic immigration, but refugee, asylum seeker immigration is economic as well, and is fundamentally integrated to our economic sustainability and economic development moving forward. And the federal government recognized that by giving special status to asylum seekers who were working in the healthcare field. And that was also something that was very, very innovative. And that program actually came into force yesterday. So this is a very recent development, where you have now asylum seekers who came into the country and are working in the healthcare field, now will have their status upgraded and will be able to stay in the country, because they are contributing to this very strategic and necessary sector. But a lot of other sectors are looking and asking for this, namely agriculture and other sectors in mass manufacturing. But what we need to, I think, really understand here is the fact that we need to look at an integrated framework here regarding immigration. I hope that with the incoming administration in the US, we can start a dialogue that necessarily needs to include a lot of different levels of not only government, but also all kinds of groups that are involved with asylum seekers, refugees, and immigration. Now, I know that this is putting the bar pretty high to start off with, but there needs to be a broader conversation about this. Now, the Canadian federal government has already raised its quota and has signaled its intent to every year to have a much higher number of immigration in Canada. But for example, a province like Quebec, which does have its say in terms of the number of immigrants, has reduced over the past 2 years its numbers of immigrants into the province. I see Farouz coming online, so I guess I have to finish this up. So the idea here, what I would like to put forward is the idea that from an economic development perspective, there needs to be a much more integrated framework that takes into account a lot of coordination between both federal governments, but also provincial and state governments, economic players, but also groups that are involved in dealing with immigration and refugee issues, so we can have a much more efficient way of welcoming these refugees and asylum seekers, of integrating them, because they are necessary for and are already contributing in a very significant way in our economic and social development. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you both. Yeah, it's very fascinating discussion, and kind of just from your remarks, I think we were able to really start to understand how the US and Canada view immigration through slightly different lenses, even if they're dealing with similar dynamics. One question that has come up a few times that within the chat that neither of you got a chance to touch on, and maybe just try and speak to it briefly, is this issue of statelessness. And kind of given the discussion around asylum seekers, is this question about how the US and Canada deal with any asylum seekers that might be stateless, and there might not be a place to deport them to or return them to, obviously depending on each country's ways of dealing with asylum seekers. So David, do you want to talk to that quickly?
Well, quickly, I mean, and I can start off with saying, so under the Trump administration, there were actually court challenges in Canada on the Safe Third Country Agreement, because I think this is important to point out. And actually, the Federal Court of Canada suspended the application, ruled that the US was no longer a safe third country. And that's currently being appealed by the Canadian federal government. So the Safe Third Country Agreement still is in force in Canada. But what it does tell you is that the refugee claimants law and the asylum seeker legislation in Canada needs to be modernized to recognize this form of status, the statelessness, because the problem right now is that to be a recognized refugee or asylum seeker, you have to fall into these very now considered by some narrow criteria of humanitarian reasons. And for example, economic hardship is not a recognized motive for asylum requests. And so, and this creates one of the many paradoxes in our situation, where we actually in Canada need more immigration. We need this because of our labor shortage. And so if we want to grow our society, grow our economy, we actually need this. So there has to be an important, I think, an important review of the system right now. But again, this needs to be looked at in the basis of, I think, an integrated framework with the US.
Absolutely. Doris, can you follow up on this safe third country issue? Another kind of thing that's striking up some conversation in the chat between some of our participants. and kind of any thoughts on how the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, may respond to that?
I mean, where Canada is concerned, it seems to me that the issue will pretty much resolve itself, which is to say that if the US puts in the Biden administration, restores asylum policies and restores refugee admissions and creates a different enforcement framework for interior enforcement, it certainly should satisfy, I would think, the Canadian courts that the United States is a safe country, and therefore the safe third country agreement, the underlying assumption, would be valid again. As to the changing of a safe third country agreement, that would do what Canada has been seeking, which has to do with the ports of entry vis-a-vis between ports of entry. I'm not so sure that the United States is prepared or that the Biden administration would be prepared to change that. So I think that that will continue to be a difficult issue, just as it was from the very start when we negotiated it in the first place. The other part of safe third country that we will see from the Biden administration, I'm quite confident, is that the agreements that the Trump administration made with Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador that called them safe third countries for the purposes of creating return they will either be formally withdrawn or they simply won't be exercised. That was very much a what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, it was a cover for just simply trying to return people. There is no evidence whatsoever that could substantiate those as safe countries.
Thank you. So, kind of given this discussion about asylum seekers and what's happening at our borders and those coming to the US and Canada seeking refuge, I think naturally brings up this conversation of detention centers. And clearly that's been in the news a lot, certainly within the United States. But then also, I think, in Canada, David, you talked a little bit about the system being overwhelmed, and we know that Canada has much less detention centers, which is probably a good thing, but is it that the system is overwhelmed or that the system hasn't been built to deal with the influx or the demand at the border? And so maybe you two can kind of speak to that kind of from the perspectives of each of our countries. So Doris, if you want to kind of talk about the detention center infrastructure here in the United States and how that might be reformed under the Biden administration. And then David, what reforms do you think could the Canadian system might be able to help this influx of asylum seekers?
Yes, so there has been obviously a very strong reaction against the way in which detention has been used by the Trump administration. And it's not just the Trump administration, detention in general. And the role that detention plays in an immigration system is a very contentious topic. And we don't have as much evidence on it from simply a research standpoint as we might wish, but we do know more than we've been willing as a policy matter to act on. Now, where detention in the United States is concerned, the big switch that happened in the Trump administration is that the Trump administration detained asylum seekers, except for those that are by law unaccompanied children and families exempted, or where there weren't facilities. But there is just a very deeply held belief in the enforcement agencies in particular, that unless you detain people, they will not appear for their hearings and they will disappear and become part of the unauthorized population. And that, is really an article of faith. And that is something in the culture of enforcement agencies that I think can be overcome and that I believe the Biden administration will try to overcome. But the way to overcome it has to be by reworking the asylum system in a way that makes it possible for people to have their hearings in a timely fashion, have representation as a way of ensuring that indeed the judgments and people are fully able to access what rights they might have, and then returning people to their home countries who are not eligible. But of course, we know that even under the earlier definitions of asylum, the majority of the people that we have now in the asylum system coming across the southwest border, even if more of them are eligible, and they are likely to be, it's still not going to be the majority. And so that is what then leads to the importance of more regional efforts, of longer term efforts, of job programs, other kinds of legal pathways to come to the United States where we might have labor market needs in the way that that you've been talking about. It is a window into a set of other needs. And the Biden administration has talked definitely about that kind of a much bigger framework and bigger set of efforts, but that takes time, and there will be so many competing priorities for this new administration coming in. That is one of the major problems.
Thank you.
So from the Canadian perspective, I mean, first of all, I mean, they're not called detention centers, and the approach is completely different. If I take an asylum seeker that crosses into Canada, that person is met by Canadian border authorities, but this person gets a health check, and a security check is made, given a file number. And if that person does not have resources, not able to move from, let's say, this person crosses over into Canada and Quebec, for example, at the border with the US, then that person is sent to shelters, not detention centers, shelters. In most of them are in Montreal. In Ontario, they've been sent to Toronto, and actually the government, the Quebec government, so provincial governments in Quebec, for example, will give that person, a shelter for a number of days, and will also give that person an actual check, money to get that person started. And so the approach is different here, and also that person, if that person is able to work, will usually be able to get a work permit within the first 15, 21 days of that person being in the country. So the challenge here with the Canadian system and the provincial system is that, like I said at the beginning of my remarks, we have to catch up with the new reality, whether it's climate refugees or the mobility. Even currently within the pandemic, we're still getting 250 asylum seekers a week, and we're going to finish the year with an estimated 6,000 to 7,000 asylum seekers, and that adds up to the economic immigration and the previous backlog of asylum seekers. So the fact is that when we had that first wave in 2017, we had to open up gyms in schools. We had to open up the Olympic Stadium in Montreal to be able to take care of these people. So the approach is about taking care of them and helping them get back on their feet after, let's face it, a very difficult and traumatic experience. But at the same time, the governments, the federal and provincial and municipal, have had a hard time making sure that to take care of these people, getting them on their feet, because sometimes, for example, the economic need for them is not in the large centers, it's in the regions. How do you get them into the regions? And even in the regions, having the resources to properly integrate. And so there's a lot of challenges in terms of taking care of these people once they arrive, also integrating them, giving them the resources, giving them the tools. But the governments, again, it's a patchwork, and it's a framework that takes a lot of different actors to come in and contribute to this situation. So the idea here is we need to modernize the approach, but we also need to modernize the criteria to adapt to this new reality. And again, going back to my earlier point, I think we need to also see if we can't develop an integrated framework with the US and the states.
So I'm glad you said that, and we just have maybe just a minute or two, and we need to wrap up. But I think it takes us into another really important question, and that is this, I think, question in this issue of partnerships with our border countries. And so, Doris, Debbie just kind of hit on that a little bit about what Canada needs to do to work with the US to really modernize the system and really kind of help improve our immigration systems. And I think, there's some questions about what that means for US in working with our other border country, and that's Mexico. And that issue has been in the news a lot as well, I think, particularly with asylum seekers. And so what are your thoughts on what the US could do to maybe work with Mexico in a development plan on Central America, or how to work with Central American countries more through Mexico to lessen the pressure at the Southwest border?
I think, thank you, because that is really the ultimately longer term proposition here, and one that the Biden administration clearly understands, is signaling that it wants to do, and has some real experience, because Biden himself, when he was vice president in the Obama administration, was tasked with the relationships with the Central American countries around the earlier migration crisis that occurred with unaccompanied children in 2014. So I think we will see a heavy emphasis on that and a commitment. But it will take Mexico in particular as a key partner, because this does rest on the assumption that now Mexico and the US are both destination countries. Mexico has real capacity issues. Mexico has a more relaxed definition for asylum, and so it's actually useful for people from Central America that are in need to not make as long a journey, but apply for asylum in Mexico where there are valid cases. All of those things provide opportunities for the US and Mexico to work together. There's a little tension in the relationship, quite a bit of tension in the relationship right now over unrelated issues that will need to be addressed. And so again, the opportunities are there, but the wherewithal will require a considerable effort.
David, any thoughts on that, given that, sometimes that spillover at the border kind of affects Canada, as you mentioned, what happened in 2017?
Well, I mean, the situation between the US and Mexico is completely different, and it's very hard to draw comparisons. But I think what we need to understand now is the fact that from a Canadian perspective, we're getting more, the numbers show it, we're getting more and more asylum seekers over the past few years. And most of them, if not all of them, are transiting, either are already in the US or are coming from another country, but coming to Canada through the US. And again, the idea here is, the last 4 years, it was very hard to find any way to coordinate efforts on how to manage these situations. And so that's where, and what we need to realize, and again, it's not just, so a federal decision, that's a Canadian federal government decision or a US federal government decision, has a lot of consequences on provinces, on states, on cities, because so there's just so many types of jurisdictions that are involved in dealing with asylum seekers and refugees, and making sure that that situation is taken in charge in the right way. But again, I think we have an opportunity here to modernize our systems. I think that's one of the problems when you look at the Canadian system, the new reality is that there are going to be more and more asylum seekers, more and more refugees. Canada is a destination. And on top of that, we need to find a way to integrate it, because at the same time, from an economic perspective, we have an integrated economy with the US and Mexico. Our economy is going to be yet again transformed by the pandemic, as I discussed earlier. If you look at agriculture, mass manufacturing, healthcare, for examples. But we're going to need also that labor. We actually need that labor, and how to integrate that labor. And currently our laws and regulations are so different and so not tailored to this new reality that our systems can't really adapt fast enough.
Yes, fascinating discussion. And I think we could talk about this for much longer if we have the time. And unfortunately we don't, but there's been a number of questions and a lively discussion in our chat. If either of you are able to stick around and read through them a little and maybe respond to some folks, because there are a few questions we didn't get a chance to get to, and I apologize. But it has certainly been a really interesting discussion, even for myself, feeling like I'm between these two here in Michigan, and really seeing how a lot of these dynamics that you two spoke about are at play. And so it'll be interesting to see where we're at even in a year from now. So given that, I would like to just wrap up our discussion here, and thank you all for joining us and listening in and asking your questions. And you know, looking forward to hearing more from our next panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for that very lively discussion. Thanks, Feiruz, for being the moderator. It was really excellent and much appreciated, and much food for thought that hopefully will contribute to the discussion in this next segment, which will focus on the role of civil society. And I will introduce our moderator for that panel, which is Stacey Simon. She's a Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships and Policy at World Education Services. Stacey is a nonprofit leader in the intersection of organizational strategy and human engagement. So without any further ado, I pass the moderation to Stacey.
Thank you, Jack. What an amazing first panel. I feel the need to take a deep breath and regroup. There is no clear delineation between what was talked about then and what we will talk about now. Am I okay to continue?
Yes.
Yes, great.
So yes, I'm Stacey Simon, and I'm from World Education Services, also known as WES. I'm descended from refugees who arrived in the US from Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century. And today, along with many of you, I'm celebrating the 5th day of an 8-day Festival of Lights. Hanukkah is part of the tradition handed down to me, a holiday about rededication and rebuilding. And that's also what WES is focused on. WES is a social enterprise, and our vision is a world where everyone is able to put their education, experience, and skills to work anywhere in the world. We have offices in New York and Toronto, and we talk across the US-Canadian border every day in our programmatic, policy, and philanthropic work. Today, we're here for another cross-border conversation, of course, among a broader group of civil society leaders, all of whom want to leverage our shared vision and passion for the possibility of just, coordinated, and effective migration systems and practices. The US and Canada have been at different times and in different ways global leaders in welcoming immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, providing human rights protections and support. And yet today, as you all know, our countries have very different political and cultural landscapes. Canada has a managed immigration system. Different levels of government invest a total of $1.8 billion with some 500 organizations in the settlement sector. Quebec has a separate agreement with the federal government and receives additional funds. In Canada, as we've heard, immigrants are seen as valuable addition to the country's fabric and, more importantly, to the Canadian labor market. By contrast, the US has a broken immigration system with little agreement between the two major parties about how to fix it. As well noted in the first panel, again, after 4 years that have eroded our work in significant ways, the incoming administration has committed to making immediate dramatic changes in the first 100 days. But some of the damage cannot necessarily be undone. And even though Joe Biden's campaign slogan was to build back better, the challenges we faced prior to 2016 were already substantial. So against that backdrop, we're here to discuss civil society engagement and influence. Our panelists have been asked to address the following question. Despite the differences in our national context, how can advocates in our two countries work together to contribute to the strengthening of systems that are just and responsive to the needs of migrants and this moment in history? Before we hear their thoughts on that question, let me introduce them to you. First, we'll hear from Mark Hetfield, President and CEO of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, known as HIAS, which is based in the state of Maryland. HIAS is a major implementing partner of the United Nations Refugee Agency and the US Department of State. And Mark has also worked for the US Immigration and Naturalization Service and the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's also a frequent commentator and writer on refugee issues. Then we'll hear from Na Vung Sandoval, the Refugee Congress delegate for the state of Colorado and currently an investigator at the Colorado Department of Law. She served at the State Homeland Security Office and has been an affiliate faculty member at 2 universities. Na's an educator, a storyteller, and a lobbyist. She's also a fierce and passionate social justice advocate for marginalized communities, including refugees, immigrants, asylum seekers, and stateless people. She will keep us rooted in the lived refugee experience. Then our Canadian panelists, starting with Marjorie Villefranche. Marjorie is the CEO of Maison d'Haïti, a Montreal-based community organization dedicated to the integration of immigrant families. She has won awards for her work with and on behalf of immigrant women and undocumented migrants. She's also been recognized for her work in documenting Haitian immigration history in Canada. I'm very pleased she's here today to contribute her rich perspective to this conversation. And last but not least, well known to all of you from Canada, we'll hear from the Honorable Thomas Mulcair. Tom is a political analyst, commentator, and professor of sustainable development at the University of Montreal. He was also the former leader of the official opposition in Canada from 2012 to 2015, and was Quebec's Provincial Minister of Sustainable Development, Environment, and Parks from 2003 until 2006. He will also shed light on the role of civil society in the migration space and perhaps help us to start to synthesize what we've heard. So I'm delighted to welcome all the panelists, and everyone, please send your questions for any or all of us to the Q&A box as soon as they occur to you. We'll turn to your questions when all 4 speakers have finished. So Mark, would you like to get us started?
Sure. Thank you so much, Stacy. And I was going to show a video, but given that I think we're running a little low on time and we have a lot of panelists and a lot to discuss, I'll just go straight to discussion. And so I would divide our time into 3 eras. There's the normal times, which was before Donald Trump became president of the United States. Then there was the Trump era, and then there's the future. And I'm going to touch on both resettlement and asylum, and where and how I think the Canadian civil society and US civil society can work together. Now, a word about HIAS. As Stacy said, I'm the president of HIAS, and I've been with HIAS off and on for over 30 years. And we've always worked very closely with Canada. Our sister agency in Canada is JIAS, the Jewish Immigrant Aid Services, which is now based in Toronto. We've worked very closely with them over the decades. HIAS often works in other countries, identified predominantly over our history Jewish refugees and sent them to the United States and Canada, and in Canada they would be resettled through JIAS. But JIAS has, like HIAS, expanded their focus to not just Jewish migrants and refugees, but all refugees. We like to say we used to resettle refugees or welcome refugees because they were Jewish. Today we welcome refugees because we are Jewish, and JIAS shares that value and also holds the private sponsorship agreement, community sponsorship agreement with Canada. For the Jewish community. We also work closely with CCR, not Clearwater Revival, but the Canadian Council for Refugees. And they have been a close partner of Refugee Council USA, the coalition to which HIAS belongs. And you met Adam at the beginning of the last session. So they have been a very close ally with us over the years. And before the Trump administration took office, HIAS, I would say that we worked much more closely together. Frankly, for the last 4 years, HIAS and our sister agencies in the United States, particularly resettlement agencies, but also asylum agencies, HIAS does both, have been very focused on affairs here. We've been playing a strong defense, trying to protect the asylum and refugee resettlement systems from being totally destroyed by the current administration, soon to be former administration. But before 2017, before Donald Trump took office, there was a state of affairs where the United States had the largest refugee resettlement program in the world by far. Since 1980, when the Refugee Act of 1980 was passed, the United States had resettled over 3.1 million refugees through our resettlement system. Canada, which is 1/10 of our size, as you know, in population, resettled about 700,000 refugees over that time. Substantial, given that Canada is 1/10 of our size. That's more than 1/5 of the number of refugees we've resettled. But obviously not as large as a country like the United States can handle. But the greatest asset of the U.S. system in resettlement has been our size, our ability to impact, to demonstrate responsibility sharing with countries of first asylum by taking a lot of refugees. Canada has been very inventive in terms of the way that refugees are resettled, through their Women at Risk program, through the community sponsorship model, and through right now Canada is a pioneer looking at alternative or complementary pathways to protection. So in other words, taking people who need protection, but who may have skills and may qualify for an immigration visa or an education visa, and bringing them to Canada under those regimes. This is something the US does not have the flexibility to do. Canada is very much piloting that, but we can learn from Canada. So Canada has always played this role of being kind of they can't take the numbers that the United States can take, but they really are pioneers in terms of identifying innovative new ways to resettle refugees. And so we're hoping that that's a role that once again, they can play in terms of the US-Canadian relationship, and civil society in both of our countries will be key in terms of advocating for changes, looking to Canada again as an example, as a workshop for practices that we can adopt here in the United States. I'll also want to say that in terms of the asylum system and the asylum regimes, when the Safe Third Country Agreement was negotiated, and Stacey alluded to this, the U.S. asylum system was not perfect. It's not like we used to be great and then Donald Trump became president and destroyed everything. I mean, our system was very broken to begin with, in particular our asylum system, frankly. And the way that we treat certain asylum seekers, particularly those who enter and claim asylum at the port of entry, country or enter without authorization and then claim asylum. As you no doubt aware, and as Doris alluded to, asylum seekers who enter that way are put into detention, and Canada may not call their reception centers detention centers, but really in the United States, our detention centers resemble prisons or actually jails in every respect. There is no distinction between jail conditions and conditions in detention centers where asylum seekers are detained. So when the Safe Third Country Agreement was being negotiated between the United States and Canada, I remember quite vividly that the UNHCR representative to Canada at that time, Judith Kuhlman, got herself into a little bit of hot water when she told I believe a committee in the Canadian Parliament that the United States back then was not a safe third country, was not a safe country because of the way that we treat detainees. And this was back, of course, to almost 20 years ago when she gave that testimony, which was not well received by the Canadian government, nor was it well received by the US government. But she had the courage to tell the truth in that regard. And of course, the detention system that we have right now in the United States is very much the same as it was back then. It's largely unchanged. The Obama administration tried to change the detention system, tried to make it more civil in nature. I do not think they were successful. And the Trump administration has snapped things back to as bad or worse than they were before. But so it's important to realize that the Safe Third Country ruling in the court in Canada that came down in July was on two grounds. One was the treatment of asylum seekers in detention in the United States, but also the fact that they may not be able to access asylum due to changes in procedures in the United States, which have occurred under the Trump administration. And just, normally when there's a change in government, the outgoing administration will stop issuing regulations to allow the new administration to take over during the time between the election and the inauguration. That has not happened. That has not happened in this country with regard to asylum for sure. In fact, over the last week, the Trump administration has issued two rules, well, actually 4 rules, impacting the asylum system. They just issued a rule that's over 400 pages, overhauling our asylum regulations, making it much more restrictive and much more difficult to get asylum in this country, if not impossible, if you have a claim as a Central American. And they then issued just this week, in fact, I think it was yesterday, another 200 and some page rule overhauling the appellate procedure for asylum seekers and immigrants, basically stripping all due process from the system, on top of a number of other less significant changes they've made to make it more difficult for asylum seekers and refugees to get green cards and to bring immediate relatives into the United States. This has all happened since the election. And so the asylum system in the United States has actually deteriorated significantly since that ruling was made in July. Now, I was really proud to see, I was very proud that HIAS has had to change its advocacy tactics over this administration. And I see that in Canada, they're doing similar things. In the United States, traditionally, we have access to the executive branch. We advocate with the executive branch. They may not usually agree with us, but we at least are able to get in the door and argue with them. And of course, we've had access to Capitol Hill to make arguments for legislation. Over the past administration, the Trump administration, we have not had any access to the executive branch. And Congress has been even more dysfunctional than usual, not able to pass any legislation whatsoever. So we've resorted to the courts, and HIAS has, and other organizations, other refugee and asylum organizations have routinely had to go to the courts to sue on things that we never dreamed we would have to sue on. Notwithstanding that we receive a lot of assisted funding from the United States government, we did not let that deter us from taking them on. And so HIAS has challenged in court and fairly successfully a number of regulations and changes in policy that this administration tried to make. I won't go into the details of that because I know I'm running up against time. But I will say it's proud to see our CCR colleagues and Amnesty International in Canada, as well as the Canadian Council for Churches, being the plaintiffs, challenging the Canadian government to suspend the MOU on the basis of the United States not being a safe country for asylum seekers. It is still not a safe country, as I said. The Biden administration is inheriting an unsafe country that will not change magically on January 20th. So civil society and society in Canada and the United States should continue to work together to make sure that Canada can help hold the United States accountable for improving our asylum system and making it up to standards so that we actually are a safe third country, and that agreement can continue. And I know that's a very important agreement to the government of Canada. So let's make the U.S. a safe third country again. We've already had civil society in the U.S. participating in that litigation. I know Harvard Refugee and Immigration Law Clinic was involved in a supporting role, as was the UC Hastings Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. But that will continue, and I think we're going to have to expand those alliances on both sides of the border, try to improve the U.S. asylum system, which really benefits not just refugees and asylum seekers and human rights, but both Canada and the United States. And ditto for resettlement. I'd like to see the United States and Canada work together with civil society, pushing both to pursue alternative pathways to resettlement or complementary pathways to resettlement, to pursue solutions for victims of climate change, people who are displaced due to climate change, and to take the lessons learned from private sponsorships in Canada and apply them so that in the United States we have a system where there is even more community ownership of refugee resettlement than there currently is. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my, thank you for the calls to action. You've left us wanting more. And we'll have to move on now though to Na Vong Sandoval. You ready? Please take it away.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you all for joining us today. I am thrilled. I am just thrilled that we're having this conversation. And I know that with the big shift that we are going to be faced with and the carnage of just issues that we're going to have to be facing, I could not be more thrilled that our Canadian neighbors are joining us and working toward a better society for all who are seeking refuge and safety during this very tumultuous time. So as a refugee from Vietnam, I know the firsthand challenges as a newcomer and the ongoing barriers and challenges that we continue to face in the middle of the current climate of anti-refugee, anti-immigrant sentiments. And this is really astounding to me living in the United States and have worked in Homeland Security and counterterrorism and counterintelligence, that the Canadian-US border is never discussed. We constantly focus on, and our energies are always toward and focused upon our southern border. And yet here we are with the crisis up north as well. So again, I could not be more thrilled. So today I want to share with you through my lived experiences, through my extensive advocacy for social justice, my storytelling experience, my lobbying work. And I feel that these are the following are key and essential areas that I believe the US and Canada should focus on and collaborate on in our advocacy efforts for those experiencing displacement. So I have a lot of suggestions and call to actions that I believe would be essential. The first and foremost is to continue to educate the public with facts on the root causes of displacement, as so many still don't know the very basic concepts of who are refugees like me, immigrants, asylum seekers, stateless people. And I believe that through the power of storytelling and advocacy, it can change hearts and minds and really focus upon the key issues of why people are being moved and being forced to flee from our homelands due to war, civil unrest, violence, religious and ethnic persecution, famine, and climate change. And secondly, through the grace of a very compassionate president when I arrived in the United States and the Senate at the time, who passed the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, I was able to find safety. My family was able to find safety, and over 120,000 Vietnamese refugees and those from Southeast Asia were able to arrive here in this country. So the second call to action is going to be to dismantle and combat and dispel the anti-refugee and anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker sentiments before we can even do anything. I think that's the essential foundation that we need to be able to not only combat, but dismantle once and for all. Because as we know from our most recent election in the United States, over 77 million people do not want people like me here. So at the very core, until we're able to overcome this very tremendous barrier, all the other actions or all the other attempts are not going to be not even just successful, but they're not even going to land on the ears of people who are even going to understand that this is the largest humanitarian and international crisis that we have right now. So how do we do this? We need to change the mindset before any action can take place, before any policy can be implemented, because there's been an upsurge within the past 4 years of disallowing and banning individuals from entering into the United States with all the fear mongering that is happening in this country. So we need to combat these hateful and harmful rhetoric against refugee and immigrants, because we're depicted as any and everything that is not good for the country, as criminals, as rapists, as less than human. And we are being scapegoated for things that we are not responsible for people's uncertainty and their own personal woes. So instead, we need to be intentional with our messaging and bring forth positive messaging about refugees, immigrants, stateless people, and highlight our communities as vibrant and essential community members. The third is to work to prevent government and officials from scapegoating and blaming refugees and immigrants for their economic and social problems. We need to call out racism and hatred and xenophobia. We need to hold them accountable. Just saying that you support refugees in your campaign does not equate to things that are beneficial to our community. We need to present facts and the benefits of welcoming and supporting refugees and migrants. We need to dispel erroneous and harmful stereotypes through storytelling and advocacy by refugees and by immigrants who know this firsthand experience through lobbying, advocacy, and storytelling. Fourth, we need to combat and erase xenophobia by battling all types of it that we're seeing, which leads to actions and individuals that turns into policy that, as we have seen, turns into inhumane treatment for those seeking refuge. The fifth call to action is to create awareness of issues stemming from forced migration, such as human trafficking. Displaced people are disproportionately more at risk of being exploited due to their vulnerable state. And the US and Canada and all countries should advocate and lobby for the prosecution of those who traffic and exploit refugees and immigrants who are taking advantage of those who are fleeing our homelands. The sixth call to action, we need to expedite the backlog of already vetted refugees. This I find really interesting because I was vetted more as a refugee than when I worked with Homeland Security. That should tell you something about the mindset of people who are implementing these policies and how we're viewed by the international perspective in general. Again, we need to change that paradigm because currently we have over 120,000 refugees are in the current pipeline who have already passed rigorous security and medical checks, waiting in line and sometimes for years and decades, and who already have been considered as safe to be entering into receiving countries. The seventh call to action, demand a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants right now and stateless people. The eighth call to action, demand an end to merit-based immigration. The US approves about 1.1 million green cards a year and handing out 63% to foreigners with family connections to the US and about 13% based on their skills and abilities to contribute to the economy. The outgoing administration, thank goodness, they've advocated for what we've seen now is the merit-based immigration system, and we need to do away with that, because what it is it rewards applicants for things that they are privileged to have access to, and it unfairly denies low income and other immigrants who do not have access or opportunity or the privilege to be awarded this type of system. The ninth call to action, I would like for us to demand an end to family separations too. In the summer of 2018, the United States and our current administration enforced the zero tolerance policy, which basically means that over 2,800 migrant families had crossed the southern border and were separated from their families. But fortunately, a federal judge had ordered that the administration reunite all families in a case that continues to identify additional families that were separated as early as 2017. So I hope that these call to actions will bring an awareness that at the very core, we need to dismantle that mindset before we can even make any sort of impactful change in changing the way people feel about migration, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the call to action, insisting that we keep the voices of refugees at the center of our advocacy. Okay, now we'll turn to our Canadian panelists with Marjorie first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As a representative of a community center working directly with asylum seekers and refugees, I feel that it is important to present a vivid picture of their reality. After all, aren't we here to talk about them? To begin, I would like to present my organization, La Maison d'Haïti, and I will present the migration status in Canada, some data and some concepts. La Maison d'Haïti is a community organization that has existed since 1972, whose mission is the integration and citizenship education of immigrants and asylum seekers. The Maison d'Haïti was created by founders of Haitian origin, but it is open to all and welcome asylum seekers and immigrants of more than 45 countries. This past year, La Maison d'Haïti has received and given services to nearly 8,000 people. The type of support offered to asylum seekers and refugees in Maison d'Haïti, we accompany families in search of housing, technical and legal support to find safe and affordable housing, different workshops to understand the values and the functioning of the country. Maison d'Haïti is a real village that takes care of its inhabitants. The concept of immigration to Canada is very clearly defined by the different statutes that are recognized and to which individuals can apply above all. It is important to understand that Canada selects its immigrants. Here are the different immigrant statutes that Canada recognizes and through which he operates his selection. We have the independent immigrant, that includes the economic immigrants, the qualified workers, investing immigrants, and the entrepreneur. We have the sponsored immigrant, and we have the temporary workers. What about asylum seekers? Asylum seekers have not been selected. They are people who show up at the border and apply for protection. It is precisely these people that interested us today. Asylum seekers therefore have to go through a process very different from other immigrants to finally being recognized as refugees. Since the spring of 2017, and Mr. Hortel was talking about this before, there have been a large numbers of asylum seekers who entered Canada via the United States, not by the border, but by using an irregular entry point, avoiding this ploy to submit to an agreement on whom would have returned them to the American authorities. Why did they decide to seek asylum by getting here at this irregular point? To escape the rules of the safe third country agreement and not to be returned to the USA. Who are the asylum seekers? People living in the US fearing the end of the temporary protect status, people living with no status, people through countries of Latin America fleeing miserable life conditions and hoping for a compassionate situation in Canada. What are they fleeing? Political insecurity. They are leaving countries who have failed to protect them from injustice, impunity of abusers, from systemic problems such as poverty, food insecurity, poor sanitation, ongoing different epidemics, besides natural disasters impacting an already very vulnerable population. We are witnessing a real exodus. Thousands of people arriving by all means, plane, boats, on foot, crossing more than 10 countries to reach the US and then Canada borders. Our organization, Maison d'Haïti, welcome asylum seekers who arrive in Canada via the US. They are from Haiti, Nigeria, Yemen, El Salvador, Congo, Mexico, from more than 40 countries. These people risked their lives and the lives of their children, sometimes crossing more than 13 countries in America in order to reach our borders. More than 40% are children under the age of 14, often accompanied by their parents. Many single parents, women who have reported assault, loss of loved ones, imprisonment. Many have had to wait more months at the Mexican border with all the risks involved. And finally, in Canada, they risk deportation if they are not recognized as a refugee under the law. This is why we and hundreds of organizations in Canada ask clear administrative guidelines requiring different treatment for persons seeking protection as a result of sexual assault. Can I tell you the story of Josiane? Josiane is a 21 years old young woman. She leaves her country, Haiti, for reason of political insecurity and poverty. Josiane goes through Chile, which does not require a visa for Haitian. From Chile, Josiane sets out on a long, dangerous, difficult journey to reach the USA. Arrive at the border between Mexico and the US, she must wait in Mexico for the US to summon her to hear her request for refugee. After 8 months in Mexico, she's finally summoned. After a short stay in detention, immediately released, she decides to go to Canada, where she thinks she has better luck. When Josiane arrived at Maison d'Haïti, she was almost 9 months pregnant. As with all single refugee women who present themselves pregnant or have young children, we do not ask them who the father of their child is. Actually, Josiane is safe in Canada, and she is a nurse. Here is the path. I would like to explain the path of an asylum application in Canada. You have the request for asylum at the border, the identity verification. You have accommodation for a full month in a center for refugee, or if you cannot identify yourself, you are in detention. Registration of the application versus 15 days to write the proof supporting said application. The wait of the date to appear before commissioner. In wait of a court appearance as the result of the request, the asylum seeker and his family benefit from work permit, welfare, legal aid, an interim health program, and free access to education for children from 4 to 18. The question to be asked once the US or Canadian border are reached, are the asylum seekers safe? For us who intervene to ensure their protection, what is the way forward? Can Canadian and American work together and find lasting solutions that ensure their rights, their safety? Defending rights and supporting immigrants and refugees has been tradition of civil society groups and organizations. Government have never has this tradition. Quite the contrary. If we go back in Canadian history, we have evidence of a history of rejection and selection based on racist ideologies and stereotypes. On the other hand, organizations have always defended the rights of immigrants and refugees, offering support, help, and compassion. These organizations often work under difficult conditions, and their work must be recognized, supported, and defended with force. Currently, the main struggle that the group are fighting is that of the Safe Third Country Agreement. We do not know until now whether we will see a change with the Biden-Harris government. Many organizations oppose it because the US is not a safe country for refugees, and there is no sign of change. Quoting Mrs. Dorota Blumczynska of the Canadian Council for Refugees, every day that the rule remains in effect, more people risk being returned to imprisonment in the US and possible return to persecution. So here's the first challenge for our Canada-US relation. As long as the rules are in place, refugee claimants return to the US face detention by default in worsening conditions and with increasing barrier to protection. Quoting the Canadian Council for Refugees, every additional day that the Safe Third Country Agreement remains in effect exposes vulnerable refugee claimants to serious harm in the US. The second challenge is one of the key areas where we can work together, working to standardize the rules of refugee installation, put in place a new regulation between the two countries. These are the opportunities for cooperation between immigrants and refugee advocates in Canada and the United States. Advocacy groups have the opportunity to work together to ensure respect for the rights of asylum seekers on both sides of the border. We need to make in the basis of our advocacy with government in order to achieve a standardization of treatment in both countries. While we do not yet know the change that will take place with the new Biden-Harris government, it is most certainly a possible and realistic joint action to make in this new era. The third challenge is working towards the US adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees. And overwhelming numbers of states voted by a majority in favor of adoption of the Global Compact on Refugee, with the United States opposing it. Although non-binding, the Refugee Compact at least indicates a willingness to reassess the way refugees are cared for. Millions of refugees face years of exile and risk their lives on dangerous journey to an uncertain future. And that is why joining the Global Compact is such an important step. Our two countries must recognize the legal responsibility to protect and support refugees.
Thank you. Marjorie, please wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, brilliant.
Thank you.
You painted such a clear picture of why we all do this work and why we have to dig deep in some of the ways that you outlined for us. So thank you so much for those remarks. And now we're going to turn to our final speaker, Tom Mulcair.
Thank you, Stacy. And I want to say a big thank you to the Association for Canadian Studies, and in particular, Jack Jedwab, of course, who's the president, and my friend and longtime colleague, Miriam Taylor, who was deeply involved in the preparation of today's events. I'm going to take a step back from some of the discussions that we've had, and I had a good chance to hear the last bit and most of the Q&A with the previous panel, which gave me a taste for what was being said. And I'm going to break a lance, fighting in favor of something that might come as a bit of a surprise, because it's about the role of civil society. And of course, having spent my life involved in NGOs, and I still am, I'm going to smile a little bit as I say I'm going to make a plea for a civil society. Because you see, we've just gone through something, and Marjorie Villefranche can talk to it better than anyone. In the description that she was making of that rather large number of people who had come over the border, leaving Trump's United States for fear of being deported back, in particular to Haiti, but many other countries as well. They were, of course, having to cross at anything other than a border point, because the safe third country, which it wasn't, the rule would have sent them back to the US, and they were going to be sent to horrible circumstances. Now, in the past year or so during the pandemic, we discovered that a great many of those people had trained up for one of the jobs that was immediately available, which is to work as an orderly, often in long-term care. And when that became apparent during the pandemic, many of them had fallen sick with COVID-19. Many of them live in those areas of Montreal where people can find their first affordable rent, very tightly packed, often with many generations in the same area. And as all of you probably know, because you study and work with this, it's often the people who are in the lowest rung of the ladder who were the most apt to catch this dreaded disease. So here in Quebec, people started to realize that nos anges, our angels, had played this important role, and a government that had taken every opportunity to be Trump-like. During its campaign 2 years ago to get elected, the current government of Quebec had really used the same themes, no, not calling for a Muslim ban, but decrying massive illegal entries into Canada. Of course, they weren't illegal. It was in accordance with all of the rules of international law that we are supposed to follow. And that's the nub of my point. At the base of those international rules that have been in place since the end of the Second World War, what we learned from Nuremberg, what we have to know first and foremost is that the world has to be about aspiring to being good with each other. I was on an official trip to Sweden a couple of years ago with our Governor General of Canada, David Johnson at the time. And I was astonished as it was explained to me how the refugees leaving the crisis in Syria worked their way west across Europe, getting thrown out of Greece and then thrown out of Hungary and winding up in Sweden. Sweden, a country of barely over 8 million people, had taken in and was scrambling to help 1 million human beings coming in from that tragedy in Syria. Give that a thought, because here in Canada with our 35 million population, that would be like 4 million people coming in from Syria. In the States, that would be 40 million. You can't even consider that. And yet, at another meeting, a little while later, I was in Berlin for a meeting of the OSCE, which is there for the security and cooperation in Europe. And I heard an American congressman, but had nothing to do with the fiction writer, although I wished what he was saying was fiction, but it was very real. His name was Stephen King, and it turned out that he was too much even for the Republicans because he was turned down when he made a passionate plea in favor of white supremacy. But I was in a room, a very official room, with all the countries that had gotten together and tried to avoid the worst that could have happened during the Cold War in the wake of the Second World War. And he said that he was very satisfied with what the Trump administration was doing, like giving aluminum foil as a blanket for children who were being held in prisons away from their parents. Something's being lost. How did we get from bring me your huddled masses yearning to be free to considering them only the wretched refuse of your teeming shores? How did that happen in one of the most civilized countries on earth? And by the way, I'm a Canuck. I'm here talking about this, but I'm certainly not throwing the first stone. Because here in Canada, we have had and still have racist rules against immigration by Rom from Central Europe to Canada. We hold in place direct racist rules. The same thing, Miriam Taylor can talk to you about this. When I was a member of parliament in a central riding in Montreal, we came across case after case of Iranians who were just in the immigration system, top-notch students, great scholars, people you want coming into your country, and they were coming up against a wall. It was pure discrimination. We held press conferences to denounce the situation, and slowly but surely the wall started to crumble. That's the reality that we're living in. Last week, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, held a press conference to announce legislative moves that can best be described as a culture war against Islam. In France right now, today, it's illegal for a young French woman to go to school, to go to her high school wearing a headscarf, a hijab. But the mom of elementary school kids would not be allowed to accompany them on a school trip because supposedly this is about secularism or the separation of the church and state. This is what we're going through. Here in Quebec, there's a law that was recently enacted. It's going through the courts right now being challenged, but so far it's still there. That does the very same thing. These are women who were often brought to Canada, invited, because we needed teachers, for example, but they were bringing them in from Maghreb countries, and they're told, oh, by the way, you're going to have to take off your hijab if you want to work. Otherwise, you can't work in Quebec. You're going to have to go to another province. That's in Canada, in the 21st century. This is what we're going through. But don't think that this is a rare way of looking at the world. It's becoming mainstream. So the Europe that took care of people in my family who went through the same thing that Stacy described, the generosity of spirit, the understanding of the human values that have to underpin all of these exercises that came out of the information that came from the Nuremberg trials, everything that we've learned is being lost. In Europe now, the European Human Rights Tribunal says it's all right to ban the headscarf of young Muslim women, and it is often Muslims who are the victims of this. It was a Muslim ban by Trump. The Uyghur of Western China are being held in detention. Where is the outcry? talk about a call for action. Is it business as usual? Is our liberal economy more important than anything else? Do we only look at the people who came over the border as potentially people who can produce in our society? Or do we just say there has to be a fundamental human value guiding us in these choices and just being good human beings? These are big subjects. They require an understanding of the populism that's omnipresent in current politics, whether it's in France or here in Quebec, or as it was with the Trump regime. At the base, today's discussion is an attempt to look over the horizon and say, okay, we're into a new era, thank goodness. As of yesterday, with the official vote of the Electoral College in the States, we can start looking towards a new era, but it can't be temporary. There's something lost if it becomes mainstream and acceptable to talk about keeping people out of the US or any other country that has democratic values as being acceptable. How can we go along with that? How did we get here? And I think that the ultimate call for action is to get involved, because we can see that it's multi-level. You're going to have NGOs, you're going to have people that do. It's not the government making that decision alone. It's not an international government. It's not the UN. But all of those tools are supposed to be a reflection of what the world has learned over the past century. And that's why we have to take such great care to fight back against the intolerance that is often at the base of that populism that winds up creating the problems that we've just described, that requires so many NGOs and others to work on it. Thanks to the kind work in preparing all of this, Stacey, and I'll be ready for questions now from everybody. Thank you.
I was muted. Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought. In fact, we had one question come in earlier, which I think you started to answer. It was about the neoliberalism that we have to get over to stop just seeing people for the economic benefit they bring, but get back to the importance of providing help to them. Does anyone want to comment on that beyond what we've already heard about how to get over that neoliberalism that I think maybe more represents the attitudes in Canada, but I think we can say something about the public opinion as well in the United States. Anybody want to comment on that? I know there have been studies done, and I don't have them at hand, showing that actually public opinion is not as bad as our current president wanted to believe.
Yeah.
Us that it was.
Yeah, I can address that briefly. That, I mean, traditionally, refugees have always polled very badly in the United States since the 1930s. With the exception of Kosovar refugees in the late 1990s, where 2/3 wanted them to come in and 1/3 were against. Usually it's the inverse of that, whether you were talking about refugees from Nazi Germany or you were talking about Syrian refugees in 2015, 2016. But we have noticed that refugees and immigrants are polling more positively today than they have at any time since the mid-1960s. So, and that's in spite of it. So that's the positive aspect. The negative thing is that people have a stronger opinion now than they ever have in decades on issues related to immigration and refugees, whether it's a negative opinion or positive opinion, just a reflection of the polarization of American society. So while opinions are shifted more towards favorability toward immigration and refugees, the vehemence of those opinions is so strong on both sides that it really makes it difficult to find a middle ground, because there almost is no area for compromise.
Yes, I just wanted to bring that up because as advocates, we have to wake up in the morning and realize that there is something to build on. So thank you for that, despite the moment.
I would have to agree with what Mark had just shared as well, is that there used to be some semblance of middle ground prior to 4 years ago. There was some semblance of it in however form that took, but it seems to be just at polar opposites, divisiveness, and there is no even middle ground for any conversation of civility to even begin that conversation, which is why dismantling the normalization of this divisiveness and the xenophobia needs to be worked upon and built upon before we can even engage in anything meaningful. If we can't even get through that obstacle, then I don't know how our collective efforts can move the needle forward in this particular climate right now.
Thank you. And I'm reminded, since the attitudes are so different in the two countries, we can maybe learn something from one another there too. Going back to Mark, people are interested in knowing more about the deportation policies in the US and in Canada, if you want to speak to that, or one of our other speakers can, because Canada has just resumed deporting refugees recently as well.
Yeah, I mean, the issue in the United States is we have two systems of deportation. We have one system that's before an immigration judge, which is extremely backlogged. We literally have over 1 million cases before immigration judges that are in deportation proceedings, what we call removal proceedings. And frankly, that's one of the issues with, we can't reform the asylum process so long as we have this backlog of deportation cases, because the asylum cases are buried in that backlog. And until we have a legalization, which we haven't had since 1986, this problem is going to persist. And so the question that the Biden administration is going to have is how do we, without being able to get Congress to cooperate, how do we prioritize deportation cases? And so Obama made the first effort at that with DACA, which fortunately is continuing in spite of Trump's efforts to dismantle it. The courts required that it continue, so it will last into the next administration. So that's some relief from deportation. But with a backlog of that large, and with 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, the Biden administration, with or without legislation, is going to have to wrestle with how to prioritize deportation cases. And to address that, it just can't take it on with the volume that we're currently facing. But again, because of the polarization we just talked about, and because of the splitting of Congress, even when Congress was had a better alignment in the United States at the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration, they couldn't get immigration reform done. So whatever is going to happen is going to have to be done by executive action and discretion.
Thank you.
I would dare add, Stacey, the overarching principle here, whether it's Na's point or Mark's, I think that part of the pushback has to come not necessarily from elected officials or from people at the top, but ordinary civil discourse. There are so many people who follow religious precepts that talk about loving one another. I think we should be making sure that we talk to them and say, I believe the same thing. And that's why I think we have to be good, decent human beings. And if a little child is alone at the border and in danger, you don't say, oh, maybe this one will become a pharmacist one day, we'll let him in. You take the child and you take care of the child. And it's making that appeal to humanity and to the highest values in both of our countries. Because we aspire to these ideals, we always have. Then all of a sudden it fell out of favor. It's almost as if the Second World War and everything that we learned from it is, that's way back there. But these conflicts are going on every day. And I go back to one thing that David Hertel mentioned in the first panel that I was able to catch at the end. And I work on this a lot. And I think it's always worth bearing in mind. We just talked about Syria and the refugees and the quantities and the movements across Europe. But think about the potential for that type of movement times 10, times 20. With climate change, because this is not stuff to keep kids up at night worrying. It's just the numbers. You just look at what it could mean in terms of the security issues, the loss of the agricultural land, and so on. And these could become the biggest mass movements of people that we've ever seen in history very rapidly. Like I'm talking 20, 30 years max. So I think that we've got to start working back on the fundamentals, which is our basic human values. And these are the things that have to inspire everything else that we do. They are the underpinnings of our free and democratic societies.
And Tom, on that score, do you think that the new legislation for refugee claimants in the healthcare sector in Canada could run the risk of setting a tone whereby refugee claimants are seen as deserving protection only when they can fill essential labor market shortages?
Yeah, I'd rather start somewhere than nowhere. So if you can catch the imagination of somebody who's like in the middle of that bell curve, listening to a little bit both sides of it and say, look, these are good people. They're here to help you. You should maybe be a good person back. Then I'll start there. I'm not going to, dig down on that debate, but ultimately it has to be about helping people who are in need, people who are in danger. That's the idea. But of course, if you can use those as a way of convincing people, fine. And I'll always give a tip of the hat to our current prime minister, even though he was a political adversary on a lot of other issues. But he's always taken pains to explain that diversity and bringing people in is not a problem. It's one of our strengths. And I also believe that that's been an underpinning in the States. A century ago, that poem on the Statue of Liberty that I gave 2 verses from before, that was something that everybody believed in. And now all of a sudden it's the drawbridge approach. Well, we're inside, we're kind of okay. Bring that thing up, leave them in the moat. This is our fence, and we're kind of okay, and they can pay for it. I think it's going to take courage, and I do think that having someone as experienced and seasoned as Biden might provide an opportunity to inspire people, because he's not going to be looking at the next election cycle as much as other people would. He's going to be thinking, I want to do the right thing, and that's everything that he gives me the impression about. And I think that will inspire a lot of Americans if that discourse is shared widely. And the Stephen Kings of this world belong to the trash heap of history, not the writer, the former member of Congress.
Thank you. And because of the work I do, I'm aware that on the US side of the border, there's not enough recognition of the talents that immigrants and refugees bring, who are not actually admitted because of those talents, but they coming in increasing numbers of folks with BA and higher, and can contribute to the economy in ways that are not recognized. And there's more to talk about on that score also to balance that out. Thank you so much. Any last comments from our panelists before I get to your lightning round? I had asked you each to come prepared to share a resource, something that you could leave our participants with to get further along in collaborating across the border. And I want to point out, Mark, something that you put in the chat, that HIAS is one of the few NGOs. Could you say it?
Sure. HIAS has an agreement with the government of Canada to resettle refugees, to refer refugees for resettlement to Canada. So we identify refugees based on their vulnerability, identify them to Canada, and Canada will then consider them for resettlement without requiring them to go through UNHCR.
Thank you. Okay, you want to lead off with your resource, please, and then we'll go in the order that you all presented.
Well, my resource is basically CCR and RCUSA, right? I mean, I think these are 2 coalitions that work in our 2 countries, and we really have to find a way to continue to. We've been working together, but to work together even more than we have in the past, because as Linda Thomas Greenfield, the new designated U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said, multilateralism is back. And now it's up to the NGO civil society sector in Canada and the United States to take advantage of that offer and to bring ourselves together to make sure that we are one. We advocate as one continent, as one North American community.
Thank you. Nah?
Thank you, Stacy. So my suggestions are a couple of books for folks to read. The first one is The City of Thorns, 9 Lives in the World's Largest Refugee Camp, which was published in 2016. Also, The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, published in 2018 by a Vietnamese refugee, Viet Thanh Nguyen, also a Pulitzer Prize winner. Also Malala's book, We Are Displaced, published in 2019, that talks about firsthand accounts of refugees. And if you are more inclined to watch films, I would suggest Human Flow by Ai Weiwei, who is a Chinese artist and social justice advocate and activist, and talks about the firsthand accounts of the migration of refugees throughout the world. Beautiful, beautiful cinematography in this documentary. And Stacy gave me the great idea and reminded me that I gave my first TEDx talk 3 weeks ago. And the title of my talk is Assimilation is Colonization, which really is a, I'm not saying this because I gave this talk, but I feel that this topic is extremely pertinent and can be used as an educational tool for those who work in this field and throughout, to educate those who don't work in the field. Again, entitled Assimilation is Colonization, available on the TED site. Thank you.
Marjorie?
Yes, I would like probably to say that a big resource for us in Canada is the Canadian Council for Refugee. And in Quebec, it's the Table de Concertation Refugee Immigrant, which is an umbrella that, get together all the organization that works with refugees and asylum seekers.
Thank you. And Tom, you have one for us?
Well, I have an unsuspected resource, probably even for people in Canada, which is the office of every single member of parliament, all 338 of them, because they have special access to the immigration and refugee departments and parts of the government. And very often, if they're so inclined, they can push these issues. And going back again to what Na said before, you have to have a call for action. You'd like to see things change and people to change their attitude. And even if you're dealing with a member of parliament who's not so inclined, if you do manage to get time with them, and they pretty well always give you that time, you can explain to them what it is, that experience, and what it is, why it's important, that the values that are reflected in the legislation in Canada find a decision, manage to link up with a decision that takes care of people who are in the greatest need. So that would be the resource that I would refer people to. And it's not one that's often thought of, but of course the big end goes that Marjorie Villefranche just mentioned are of course great, but I would suggest that that can be a twofer because you can actually get help for somebody, but you can also help inspire, inform, educate some MPs, even when they're not on site. I'll end by saying this, Stacey. It's something that we've lived a lot with. It's a term that we've heard a lot here in Canada for over the past couple of generations, which is national unity. It's the first time I've ever heard Americans concerned about national unity in the wake of all the divisiveness of Trump and all the shenanigans about the election that was stolen and all that nonsense. I do think that there's a unique opportunity to turn the page, and it has to be one based on values. Fundamental human values. It's the same one so that I hear Mr. Biden espouse all the time, right back to the beginning. What is the Biden era? What does that represent? I think that first and foremost, because he was there all along with President Obama, I do think that we can talk about hope, and it's a hope that's shared across the border.
Fantastic. I do feel like we're a step closer to the possibility of some real joint action in the future, if only by extending our networks across the border. And I was surprised that so many of the panelists had not met before and were new to each other. And I think there's the beginning of a lot of good conversation, even among us and among the participants. I wish we were in the same room so that we could actually chat after this, but we'll have to take it as it is. So thank you again to the panelists. And thank you to Miriam Taylor and her team who have been working behind the scenes. And of course, thanks to Jack and to Adam, our hosts, who have given us great venues for these conversations for the past few years. And they will continue, I trust. So back to you.
So Adam, I don't know if it's you or I that's supposed to begin. I gather since you're muted, I'm the one who's beginning. So let me say thanks to all the moderators and panelists. It was an absolutely fantastic and very enriching dialogue and the beginning of a conversation that I'm certain will continue into 2021. And I know we'll find ways to continue to support this conversation, which is so critical and which I think there'll be multiple opportunities for us to move forward after January 20th of 2021. I look forward to continuing to work with many of you and want to thank my esteemed colleague, Adam Hunter, for helping to bring this together, and my team led by Miriam Taylor, who did again an outstanding job in supporting this and in engaging everyone in the discussion. We are certainly going to continue with the Metropolis North America program in 2021. It's very likely to be virtual, but I'm very much looking forward to an opportunity to see all of you again in person as we make progress and move forward with vaccination and look forward very much to this conversation in person, ideally at some point later in 2021, if not thereafter. But I'm very excited about what I heard today. Et je veux remercier tous les conférenciers. On apprécie infiniment votre présence ici et vos lumières afin de nous alimenter pour des conversations essentielles dans l'avenir. Nous anticipons avec beaucoup d'intérêt et beaucoup d'enthousiasme l'arrivée de l'administration Biden et Harris. Je ne pense pas que c'est un commentaire partisan. I don't think that's a partisan commentary coming here from Canada. I liked actually Mark's analogy of the before, during, and after. And we look forward, as I said, nous souhaitons continuer cette conversation que nous allons certainement appuyer dans le cadre de Métropolis Amérique du Nord. So with that said, Adam, please close this with your comments.
Thanks. I just want to start by thanking all of the panelists and the expert moderators we had. It was really a tremendous and insightful conversation. Revealed for me the key importance of having these migration refugee conversations in a cross-border and even more importantly, North American context. Really appreciate especially the second panel and all of the calls to action that are so important. And Mark Hetfield's call, multilateralism is back, his quote of Lisa Thomas Greenfield. We are in active discussions with our CCR colleagues, and this is but one event of many to come. So look forward to continuing the conversations. Thank you all for attending, and for those who organize, especially on the ACS team. We're grateful for the partnership, and we're wrapping up here perfectly on time. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you. Just one
Oh, that was
second. Just one
fabulous.
second. We'll just end it.
Okay.
We're going to end the webinar. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you.